January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick and relentless, blanketing the shattered remains of what had once been a panzer column. Oberleutnant Friedrich Steiner stood motionless beside the smoking hulk of his Tiger II, its massive gun now pointed uselessly at the gray winter sky. His breath came in short, visible bursts. Around him, the forest floor was littered with the twisted metal carcasses of German armor. Machines that had been invincible just weeks before, now reduced to charred monuments of a dying Reich. But it was not the cold that made Steiner's hands tremble. It was the sound. From beyond the tree line, a low, mechanical rumble grew steadily louder. Not the deep-throated roar of a few tanks, but something else entirely. A continuous industrial thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Steiner had heard this sound before, 3 days ago, and again yesterday. Each time, the American tanks came in numbers that defied comprehension. Each time, his crew destroyed 2, perhaps 3 of them. And each time, by the next morning, twice as many returned. He looked down at his oil-stained hands, at the iron cross that no longer felt like a symbol of strength, and whispered a question that thousands of his countrymen were beginning to ask. Where do they all come from? This was not a question born of mere curiosity. It was the sound of an ideology beginning to crack. 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1941, the German war machine had been a force of terrifying efficiency. The Blitzkrieg had carved through Europe like a scalpel through silk, leaving nations toppled in days, sometimes hours. The panzer divisions were the spearhead of a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, unstoppable. When Hitler's armies turned eastward toward the Soviet Union, they brought with them not only superior tactics but also a profound ideological conviction that German engineering, German discipline, and German will were inherently superior to anything the decadent democracies of the West could produce. The United States, in particular, was viewed with contempt. To the Nazi leadership, America was a nation weakened by capitalism run amok, by racial mixing, by the softness of democratic compromise. It was a country of Hollywood fantasies and assembly line mediocrity, incapable of producing anything of true martial quality. When America finally entered the war in December 1941, German military planners anticipated that American industry might eventually pose a challenge, but not for years. Certainly not in time to alter the outcome of the war. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Germans failed to understand, what their entire ideological framework prevented them from understanding, was that American industrial capacity was not a weakness to be exploited, but a force of nature to be feared. The very characteristics that Nazi propaganda mocked, mass production, standardization, the democratic inclusion of millions of workers from every background, were about to become the instruments of their destruction. By 1945, the question Oberleutnant Steiner whispered in the Ardennes forest had become the haunting refrain of an entire generation of German soldiers. How could the Americans build tanks faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them? The answer lay not in any single factory or invention, but in the transformation of an entire nation into what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. In the span of less than 4 years, the United States achieved an industrial mobilization so complete, so overwhelming, that it fundamentally altered the mathematics of modern warfare. Numbers that once seemed impossible became routine. Production figures that German intelligence officers dismissed as Allied propaganda turned out to be conservative estimates. Consider the M4 Sherman tank, the primary American medium tank of World War II. It was not the most heavily armored tank. It was not the most powerfully gunned. German Tigers and Panthers outclassed it in nearly every direct combat metric. But the Sherman possessed one quality that no German tank could match. It could be built in staggering, almost incomprehensible numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 49,234 Sherman tanks. To put that figure in perspective, Germany produced roughly 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. The Soviet Union, with its massive industrial efforts, produced about 65,000 tanks total. But the United States, which had to ship its armored vehicles across either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean just to get them to the battlefield, still managed to outproduce Nazi Germany by nearly 2 to 1. The production rate was even more telling. At peak capacity in 1943, American factories were completing one Sherman tank every 45 minutes. Every hour, more than one Sherman rolled off the assembly lines. Every day, more than 50. Every week, more than 300. The tanks kept coming in such volume that they began to alter the basic strategic calculations of the war. Hauptmann Otto Carius, one of Germany's most decorated tank aces, recorded his first encounter with this reality in the summer of 1944, shortly after the Allied invasion of Normandy. His unit had successfully ambushed an American armored column, destroying 7 Sherman tanks in less than 10 minutes. It was, by any measure, a tactical victory. Carius and his men celebrated briefly, believing they had blunted the American advance. The next morning, the Americans attacked again with 14 tanks. Carius's unit destroyed 5 more before retreating. The morning after that, 21 American tanks appeared. Then 30. Then 45. In his post-war memoir, Carius wrote with a tone of weary disbelief, "We destroyed their tanks by the dozen, but they kept coming back. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. For every tank we knocked out, 2 more appeared. We began to realize that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a factory." This was the essence of the psychological shift that American production capacity forced upon German soldiers. They had been trained to think of war as a contest of skill, courage, and technological superiority, areas where German forces excelled. But America had redefined the battlefield as a contest of industrial endurance, and in that arena, there was no competition. The roots of this production miracle stretched back to the 1930s, though few could have predicted it at the time. During the Great Depression, American industrial capacity had been seen as a liability. Millions of workers unemployed, factories shuttered, the machinery of capitalism grinding to a halt. But that idle capacity turned out to be a strategic reserve waiting to be activated. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the Roosevelt administration began a cautious program of rearmament. But it was not until 1941, and especially after Pearl Harbor, that American industry truly mobilized. What followed was a transformation so rapid and so complete that it remains one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in human history. Automobile factories retooled to produce tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had been quiet for a decade suddenly worked around the clock. Companies that had made typewriters began making machine guns. A jukebox manufacturer started producing ammunition. A corset company turned its expertise in forming metal and fabric into the production of grenade belts and gun mounts. Every sector of American industry was drawn into the war effort. The Chrysler Corporation, for example, built the Detroit tank arsenal specifically to produce M4 Shermans. The facility covered 113 acres and employed more than 10,000 workers at its peak. It was designed from the ground up for mass production, with assembly lines that could produce tanks using the same principles Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles. Parts were standardized, processes were streamlined, and workers were trained to perform specific tasks with maximum efficiency. The results spoke for themselves. In 1941, before America entered the war, the United States produced a total of 4,052 tanks. In 1942, that number jumped to 24,997. In 1943, it reached 29,497. The production continued at a similar pace through 1944 and into 1945, even as American forces were already achieving victory after victory. German intelligence officers looked at these numbers and assumed they were propaganda. Surely, they reasoned, the figures were inflated to boost Allied morale and intimidate the Axis. Even if the Americans could theoretically produce that many tanks, surely the quality would be abysmal, thrown-together machines that would break down after a few miles, manned by poorly trained crews. The reality was more complex and far more threatening to German assumptions. Yes, the Sherman had weaknesses. Its armor was thinner than that of German heavy tanks. Its 75mm gun, while effective against most targets, struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers. American tank crews grimly joked that it took 5 Shermans to destroy one Tiger, 4 to die drawing its fire, and 1 to flank and finish it off. They called their tanks Ronsons, after a cigarette lighter brand whose slogan was "Lights first time, every time," a dark reference to how quickly Shermans could catch fire when hit. But the Sherman was also reliable, easy to maintain, and far more mechanically dependable than its German counterparts. The Tiger II that Oberleutnant Steiner commanded in the Ardennes, for all its fearsome combat power, was a maintenance nightmare. Its complex transmission broke down frequently. Its overlapping road wheel design meant that mud or ice could freeze the entire suspension system. Its fuel consumption was so high that many Tigers ran out of gas before they ever encountered the enemy. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for the realities of industrial war. It could be repaired in the field with basic tools. Its parts were interchangeable across thousands of vehicles. Its engine, borrowed from commercial truck designs, was well understood by mechanics with civilian experience. And if a Sherman was destroyed, another one could be shipped from America across the ocean to the front lines in a matter of weeks. This was the crucial difference. The Germans built magnificent machines, but they built them slowly, carefully, in limited numbers. The Americans built good machines, and they built tens of thousands of them. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German tank crews went into battle knowing that every vehicle they lost represented months of production, scarce resources, and irreplaceable skilled labor. They fought cautiously, trying to preserve their precious Tigers and Panthers for the battles that truly mattered. American tank crews, by contrast, knew that the industrial might of their nation stood behind them. If their tank was destroyed, another would take its place. If they took casualties, replacements would arrive. This knowledge did not make them reckless, far from it, but it freed them from the desperate, cornered psychology that increasingly gripped German forces. The symbolism went deeper than tactics. The Sherman tank became a rolling embodiment of everything American industrial democracy represented. It was not built by a master craftsman in a small workshop, but by thousands of ordinary workers, men and women, black and white, immigrants and native-born, on assembly lines that treated every tank as a standardized, replaceable unit. To Nazi ideology, which prized hierarchy, racial purity, and the myth of the exceptional individual, this should have been a recipe for inferior products. Instead, it became the recipe for victory. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of German armor doctrine, captured this growing realization in a private letter written in late 1944. Guderian had pioneered the blitzkrieg tactics that brought Germany its early victories, and he understood armor warfare as well as anyone alive. But by the final year of the war, even he could not hide his despair. "We face an enemy," he wrote, "who does not merely replace his losses. He multiplies them. Every tank we destroy is avenged by two more. Every position we hold is subjected to such material superiority that no amount of courage or skill can compensate. We are not being outfought. We are being outbuilt." This was the great heresy for a German military establishment that had built its identity on tactical and technological excellence. To admit that the war would be decided not by superior soldiers or superior machines, but by superior factories, by the unglamorous work of assembly lines and shipping schedules, was to admit that the entire ideological foundation of the Nazi state had been built on sand. And the evidence kept mounting. After the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, American armored divisions raced across France at a pace that stunned both their own commanders and their German opponents. Entire panzer divisions that had been carefully husbanded for defensive operations found themselves outflanked, surrounded, or simply bypassed by American armor that could afford to take risks German forces could not. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last great offensive in the West, a desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. In the opening days, German forces achieved surprise and made significant gains, destroying or capturing hundreds of American vehicles. But within a week, the tide had turned. American reinforcements poured into the battle, not just infantry, but entire armored divisions that had been held in reserve. Tanks that had been destroyed on Monday were replaced by Thursday. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts arrived in quantities that German logistics officers could only dream of. By January, the German offensive had collapsed, and the panzer divisions that had spearheaded it were reduced to hollow shells. The men who witnessed this deluge struggled to articulate what it meant. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, a veteran panzer officer who fought from 1939 to 1945, later reflected on the experience with the perspective of decades. "We were professional soldiers," he said, "and we understood that war was about more than courage. But we had been taught to believe that quality could triumph over quantity, that skill and will could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans taught us differently. They taught us that there is a point where quantity becomes its own form of quality. When the enemy can afford to lose 3 tanks for every one of yours, and still have more tanks than you the next morning, all your skill means nothing." This was not defeatism. It was realism arriving too late to matter. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin from both east and west, the disparity had become grotesque. German forces were reduced to deploying elderly men and teenage boys in obsolete or improvised vehicles, desperately trying to stem an advance they had no hope of stopping. Meanwhile, American armored columns operated with such overwhelming material superiority that their biggest challenges were logistical. Not how to defeat German forces, but how to manage supply lines stretching hundreds of miles, and how to coordinate movements of so many vehicles that traffic jams became a genuine military problem. The symbolic weight of American production capacity extended beyond the battlefield. In the prisoner of war camps, in the occupied territories, in the bombed-out cities of the Reich itself, German soldiers and civilians encountered physical evidence of American abundance that shattered their preconceptions. Captured German officers were transported to camps in the United States and found themselves confronted with a homeland that showed no signs of wartime deprivation. The streets were full of civilian cars. Store shelves were stocked with goods. Citizens ate fresh fruit in winter, wore new clothes, and seemed utterly untouched by the existential struggle consuming Europe. To men who had been told that America was weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse, this normalcy was more disturbing than any propaganda could have been. Klaus Huber, a panzer crewman captured in France in 1944, later described his train journey across America to a POW camp in Texas. "We traveled for 3 days," he recalled, "and everywhere I looked, I saw factories with smoke rising from their stacks. I saw freight trains half a mile long, loaded with materials. I saw new automobiles on the roads, new houses being built, people walking around as if there was no war at all. And I realized that we had been lied to about everything. This nation was not exhausted by war. It was barely trying. The food, too, became a symbol. In German POW camps in America, prisoners were fed according to Geneva Convention standards, which meant they often ate better than German civilians back home. The meals included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and even desserts. For soldiers who had been surviving on black bread and ersatz coffee, who had seen their own rations cut again and again as the Reich's resources dwindled, the abundance of American prison food was a propaganda statement more powerful than any speech. One German prisoner, interviewed years later, put it bluntly, "We were the prisoners and we were eating steak. Our guards were eating steak. Everyone in America was eating steak. Meanwhile, our families at home were starving. What kind of enemy feeds its prisoners better than we fed our soldiers?" That was when I knew the war was lost. Not because of battles, but because we were fighting a country that could afford to be generous to its enemies. The Sherman tank, arriving in its thousands, was the mechanical embodiment of this abundance. Every tank that rolled off the line carried with it an implicit message. America has so much steel, so much rubber, so much fuel, so much industrial capacity, that it can afford to send these machines across an ocean, knowing that some will be destroyed, and simply send more. This was psychological warfare of the most profound kind. It was not about breaking the enemy's will through terror, but about breaking it through the sheer, undeniable demonstration of material superiority. Every replacement tank, every rebuilt bridge, every supply convoy that arrived on schedule was a reminder that the Axis was not fighting a rival nation. It was fighting an industrial colossus that had not even fully mobilized its potential. And in truth, America had not. Despite the massive production figures, the United States never fully converted its entire economy to military production. Civilian automobile production was suspended, yes, but Americans still had access to consumer goods that would have seemed like unimaginable luxuries in wartime Germany or Japan. The rationing that did exist, limited sugar, rubber, and gasoline for civilians, was minor compared to the total mobilization scene in other combatant nations. This, too, was a strategic advantage. Because American civilians were not pushed to the brink of deprivation, there was no collapse of morale on the home front, no unrest that diverted resources from the military effort. The industrial base could operate at maximum efficiency precisely because the society supporting it remained stable, prosperous, and confident. By February 1945, Oberleutnant Steiner's unit had been reduced to a single operational tank. The Tiger II that had once been the pride of his company now sat immobile in a barn outside a village whose name he could no longer remember. They had no fuel, no spare parts, and no orders beyond "hold the line," a command that had lost all meaning when there was no line left to hold. Steiner spent the final weeks of the war in a kind of daze, moving westward with the remnants of his unit, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Along the way, he passed columns of abandoned German vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, left by the roadside not because they had been destroyed, but because there was no fuel to run them, no ammunition to fire, no purpose left to serve. And moving in the opposite direction, toward Berlin, he saw the Americans. Their columns stretched to the horizon: Shermans, tank destroyers, half-tracks, supply trucks, a river of olive-drab metal that never seemed to end. The tanks were dusty, battle-scarred, some showing the marks of German fire. But they kept moving, and behind them came more and more and more. Steiner remembered thinking that this was what it must have felt like to face the Roman legions at the height of the empire. An enemy that could absorb any loss, replace any casualty, and simply keep marching forward until resistance became meaningless. When his unit finally surrendered in early April, the American officer who processed them was polite, efficient, and utterly disinterested in the ideological speeches that had once motivated German soldiers. He checked their papers, directed them to a truck, and moved on to the next group. To the Americans, this was simply a job to be finished, not with hatred or triumph, but with the same methodical efficiency that had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. The post-war analysis of American production capacity revealed figures that still stagger the imagination. In addition to tanks, the United States produced 324,750 aircraft of all types 88, 410 landing craft 6, 500 naval vessels 2, 710, 000 machine guns 41, 400, 000 rounds of ammunition 2, 000 trucks 434, 000 jeeps. The dollar value of Lend-Lease aid alone, military equipment provided to allied nations, totaled over $50 billion, equivalent to roughly $700 billion in 2020 dollars. The Soviet Union, despite its own massive industrial efforts, received 400,000 American trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, and 13,000 aircraft under Lend-Lease, supplies that were crucial to the Red Army's offensives from 1943 onward. Even more remarkable was the speed. The United States went from producing 331 tanks in 1940 to producing more than 29,000 in 1943, an increase of nearly 9,000% in 3 years. Liberty cargo ships, which were essential for transporting materials across the Atlantic, were initially expected to take about 230 days to build. By 1943, American shipyards had reduced that time to an average of 42 days. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed in just 4.5 days as a demonstration of maximum production efficiency. These were not the achievements of a decadent, weakened democracy. They were the achievements of a system that had learned to harness the energy and creativity of millions of individuals, to coordinate their efforts through markets and planning, and to mobilize resources on a scale that no authoritarian state could match. The ideological implications were profound. Nazi Germany had built its entire worldview on the belief that authoritarian control, racial hierarchy, and the cultivation of a warrior elite would produce superior results to the chaotic, pluralistic, commercial democracy of the United States. The war was supposed to prove this thesis. Instead, it proved the opposite. The very features of American society that Nazi ideology despised, its capitalism, its diversity, its mass culture, its pragmatic flexibility, turned out to be sources of immense strength. Assembly lines that produced cars could produce tanks. A workforce that included women, African Americans, and immigrants could outproduce one limited by racial ideology. A government that worked with private industry rather than trying to micromanage it could achieve coordination on a continental scale. This was the lesson that German soldiers learned, one destroyed tank at a time. The Sherman was not just a weapon. It was a refutation of everything they had been taught to believe. In the decades after the war, historians and economists have studied the American mobilization effort as a case study in industrial organization, logistics, and national strategy. But the human dimension, the psychological impact on those who faced it, is harder to quantify. Otto Carius, the tank ace who had compared fighting the Americans to emptying the ocean with a bucket, survived the war and eventually opened a pharmacy in Germany. He rarely spoke publicly about his experiences, but in a late interview, he offered a reflection that captured something essential. "People ask me if I hate the Americans," he said. "I tell them no. How can you hate a force of nature? You can hate an enemy who fights dirty, who commits atrocities, who violates the rules of war. But the Americans did none of that. They simply built more than we could destroy. They shipped across an ocean what we could not produce in our own backyard. I fought them for 2 years, and I never saw them run out of anything. Not fuel, not ammunition, not tanks. They were not cruel. They were simply inexhaustible. And that, in the end, was more frightening than cruelty. This was not the testimony of a broken man, but of someone who had been forced to reckon with a reality that shattered his preconceptions. The Americans did not win because they were better soldiers, though many were very good. They did not win because they hated more fiercely. Most American soldiers simply wanted to finish the job and go home. They won because they built an industrial system so powerful, so adaptable, and so relentlessly productive that it buried its enemies under an avalanche of steel. The Sherman tank itself became a strange symbol in the post-war world. Thousands of surplus Shermans were sold or given to Allied nations, where they served for decades in secondary armies. Some fought in the Arab-Israeli wars of the 1950s and 1960s. Others served in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The very abundance that had made them effective in World War II meant that they were still available long after other tanks of their era had been scrapped. In museums and memorials, the Sherman occupies an ambiguous place. It was not the most glamorous tank of the war. That honor probably belongs to the German Tiger or the Soviet T-34. It was not the most powerful or the most innovative. But it was the most important because it was the tank that could be everywhere, that could be lost and replaced, that could keep advancing no matter what resistance it faced. It was the tank that taught the German army and the world that in modern industrial warfare, quantity is its own quality. That a good tank built by the thousands is better than a perfect tank built by the dozens. That the true measure of military power is not the excellence of individual weapons, but the capacity to sustain, supply, and replace them in the grinding, attritional reality of total war. There is a photograph from May 1945, taken in the ruins of Berlin. Soviet and American forces have linked up, effectively cutting Germany in half. In the foreground of the image, a destroyed German Panther tank sits with its turret blown off, the metal twisted and scorched. And parked beside it, almost casually, is an American Sherman. Dusty, scratched, its markings faded, but intact and operational. The photograph was not staged for propaganda purposes. It was simply a record of a moment, taken by an unknown photographer. But the symbolism is inescapable. The Panther, a technological marvel, the product of Germany's finest engineers, lies destroyed. The Sherman, a mass-produced workhorse, sits ready to continue the fight. This was the verdict of history, delivered in steel and oil and smoke. The men who fought in Shermans carried their own complicated feelings about the tanks. They knew the vehicle's weaknesses intimately, had lost friends to those weaknesses, had climbed out of burning hulks and watched others die trapped inside. They cursed the Sherman's thin armor, its tendency to catch fire, its gun that couldn't punch through heavy German tanks. But they also knew what the Sherman represented. Every time they lost a tank and received a replacement within days, they understood that they were backed by something unprecedented. A nation that could wage war on the far side of the world and still have resources to spare. That knowledge did not make them invulnerable, but it gave them a confidence that their enemies lacked. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, one of the most effective American tank commanders of the war, destroyed more than 250 enemy vehicles before his own Sherman was finally knocked out in September 1944. He survived the war and later reflected on his experiences. "The Sherman wasn't the best tank," he said. "But it was the best tank for us because we could get 100 of them. Give me 100 Shermans and I'll take any 50 Tigers in the world, because I'll still have 50 Shermans left when the Tigers are all burning." That's not tactics. That's mathematics. It was mathematics that the Germans could not solve. Their entire military tradition, stretching back through Clausewitz and Frederick the Great, had prepared them to win through skill and maneuver. But they had no tradition, no doctrine, no conceptual framework for confronting an enemy who redefined warfare as an industrial process. In the final accounting, the Sherman tank program cost the United States approximately $3 billion, roughly $44 billion in today's dollars. That is less than the cost of some single modern weapons systems. For that investment, America received nearly 50,000 tanks that fought on every front of the war, that helped liberate Europe and the Pacific, that played a crucial role in the defeat of fascism. But the true cost and the true value cannot be measured in dollars. The Sherman program represented a fundamental choice about what kind of war America would fight. It was a choice to prioritize production over perfection, quantity over quality, the steady accumulation of advantage over the pursuit of the decisive wonder weapon. Nazi Germany made a different choice. They invested heavily in Tigers and Panthers and King Tigers, in wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket, in jet aircraft that came too late and in too few numbers to matter. They pursued technological excellence while their economy crumbled, while their fuel supplies dried up, while their factories were bombed into rubble. The Sherman was America's answer. Not a superweapon, but a weapon system, a tank backed by the full might of American industry, supported by supply chains that stretched across oceans, maintained by trained crews who could be replaced when lost and multiplied until resistance became futile. Oberleutnant Friedrich Steiner, the officer who stood in the Ardennes forest in January 1945 and wondered where all the American tanks came from, survived the war. He spent 2 years in a POW camp in Mississippi, where he worked on a farm and was paid for his labor in scrip that could be used at the camp store. The store sold cigarettes, candy, and magazines, luxuries he had not seen in Germany since 1942. He returned to Germany in 1947, to a country destroyed and occupied, its cities rubble, its economy shattered, its future uncertain. He found work as a mechanic, married, raised children, and lived quietly until his death in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. In all those years, he rarely spoke about the war. But his daughter later recounted a conversation from the 1970s, when she asked him what he had learned from his time as a soldier. He thought for a long time before answering. "I learned," he finally said, "that ideology is a poor shield against reality. We believed that will and courage and superior breeding would be enough. We believed that the enemy was weak because they were democratic, soft because they were rich. We were wrong about everything that mattered. The Americans were not weak. Their democracy was not a weakness. Their wealth was not a burden. It was a weapon, and we had no defense against it." He paused, looking out the window at the rebuilt streets of his city, at the cars and shops and ordinary life that had returned. "I stood in the snow," he said, "and listened to their tanks coming. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, more than I could count. We had destroyed so many, but they kept coming. And I understood, finally, that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a factory. And you cannot defeat a factory by being brave." This is the legacy of the Sherman tank. Not that it was the best weapon, but that it was the weapon of a system that could build, deploy, and sustain war material on a scale the world had never seen. It was the weapon of a democracy that proved, against all the assertions of its enemies, that free people could organize themselves for total war more effectively than any dictatorship. The Sherman rolled through France and Belgium and Germany not as a symbol of technological supremacy, but as a symbol of something more fundamental, the power of an industrial democracy that had mobilized not just its soldiers, but its entire society, its factories and farms, its men and women, its ideals and its pragmatism. Every Sherman that arrived at the front was a message. America has the capacity to build this, to ship this, to crew this, to lose this, and to send another, and another, and another until victory is achieved. That message, delivered in steel and delivered by the thousands, was the message that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. Not in a single battle, but in the accumulation of battles. Not in the perfection of a single weapon, but in the multiplication of good enough weapons. Not in the triumph of ideology, but in the patient, inexorable application of industrial capacity to the problem of war. The Germans could not believe that America shipped tanks faster than they could destroy them. But belief was irrelevant. The tanks kept coming, and with them came the future. A future shaped not by the dreams of racial superiority and authoritarian efficiency, but by the practical, pragmatic, abundant democracy that had learned to build an arsenal of freedom. And when the last shots were fired, when the factories finally fell silent, when the Sherman tanks were parked in rows stretching across the peaceful fields of a liberated Europe, that future was no longer in doubt.